The human brain was fundamentally not designed to process endless tasks at once. When a professional forces a state of constant busyness, the neurological scale of pain and pleasure violently tips, physically erasing deep memory pathways to cope with the trauma. The window to reverse this cognitive decay is closing rapidly. The modern economy extracts maximum attention, rewarding high-speed task switching while leaving the individual with a fractured hippocampus. Ignoring this clinical data guarantees a permanent loss of fluid intelligence. This is not a temporary lack of focus. It is forced, systemic amnesia. Elite performers do not pride themselves on being constantly busy. They treat an overloaded schedule as a severe biological threat. They engineer environments to execute single tasks with surgical precision, protecting neural pathways from toxic friction. Society mistakenly praises the individual who juggles a dozen projects. It celebrates the worker who answers emails while eating and refuses to endure absolute silence. But clinical neuroscience views this behavior as a severe limbic trauma response. The nervous system lacks the architecture to handle parallel processing without massive cellular damage. When the organism attempts to do everything at once, the neurochemical balance shatters. The brain processes pleasure and pain in the exact same geometric location. They operate like a scale. Saturating the brain with low-friction, high dopamine inputs tips the scale toward pleasure. To maintain homeostasis, the brain rapidly spawns neurochemical counterforces, tipping the scale violently toward pain. This creates chronic anxiety. The organism frantically switches tasks to numb the pain of a dysregulated nervous system. The ultimate cost of this synthetic survival mode is the absolute destruction of the memory centers. To sustain the relentless pace, the brain aggressively reroutes metabolic energy away from memory consolidation into immediate survival processing. Professional believes they are building an empire, but biologically they're simply erasing their own past. Why task switching mutates brain cells? The illusion of extreme productivity falls apart when examining the microscopic activity inside the cerebral cortex during an overloaded schedule. Every time the brain is forced to abandon one task and instantly focus on another, it pays a massive metabolic penalty known as the switching cost. The prefrontal cortex must physically disengage from the previous neural pathway, suppress old rules, and forcefully activate new cognitive parameters. This chaotic process leaves behind a highly toxic neurochemical residue. Switching tasks dozens of times per hour, this residue accumulates like toxic sludge inside the brain tissue. During periods of profound focus and deep rest, the brain utilizes the lymphatic system to wash away beta-amyloid plaques. These plaques are the toxic byproducts of thinking. However, the hyperactive worker never allows the brain to enter this restorative state. Constant busyness acts as a concrete dam, permanently blocking the neurobiological wash. Toxins pool aggressively around the synapses. In response to this severe toxicity, the brain initiates a horrific internal defense protocol. Glial cells, the immune janitors of the central nervous system, physically mutate. Instead of cleaning plaque, they become hyperactive and violently devour the connections between perfectly healthy neurons. The organism eats its own memory pathways to survive the toxic overload of multitasking. Complex figures and important life events are quietly deleted because the biological hardware required to store them has been cannibalized. The individual assumes they're just having a forgetful day, unaware their relentless schedule is causing localized cellular death. It is an active, ongoing execution of the mind. The reason multitasking lowers IQ: a block of ice at 31 degrees looks completely stable. 1 degree hotter and it violently collapses. This is exactly how the central nervous system responds to the chronic friction of constant distraction. The profound cognitive damage remains invisible until the exact moment the system permanently breaks. Modern professionals operate under the dangerous assumption that they can force their brains to adapt to infinite inputs. They consume massive amounts of synthetic stimulants and blindly assume the physical body is managing the load. Biology never adapts to this chaotic stimulation. It merely stores the damage deep within the cellular tissue. Every time the organism is interrupted by a notification or a rapid change in priority, the brain perceives a sudden environmental threat. It secretes cortisol, an emergency survival hormone designed to spike for exactly 60 seconds to escape a physical predator. When an individual frantically switches between tabs for 10 hours a day, the brain secretes that emergency hormone continuously. Over time, chronic cortisol acts as a literal neurochemical acid on the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the exact anatomical structure responsible for converting short-term experiences into permanent memories. The delicate neural branches required to store complex information are physically burned away by this toxic acid. This is the unspoken biological cost of the modern hustle. The individual may check off 100 minor tasks on a superficial list, but they arrive at the end of the year with a brain incapable of deep, analytical thought. The constant barrage of stress hormones accelerates cognitive aging at a foundational level. The capacity to hold multi-layered concepts in the mind is entirely eradicated. The professional becomes biologically slower, masking irreversible cognitive decay with more frantic activity. The organism becomes trapped in a gray, anhedonic reality, processing tiny fragments of information and losing the ability to synthesize grand strategies. The mind becomes shallow and fragile. How hyperactive schedules destroy the hippocampus. Attempting to cure this severe cognitive erosion with modern productivity apps is the biological equivalent of scooping water out of a sinking ship with a tiny cup. The traditional worker utilizes a reactive approach, waiting patiently until the brain is completely exhausted, then applying a synthetic band-aid like heavy artificial stimulants. Elite cognitive optimization requires identifying the massive metabolic iceberg decades before the collision occurs. When a professional consumes heavy doses of stimulants to push through a jam-packed schedule, they are not creating actual brain power. They are deploying chemical illusionists. Stimulants forcefully bind to adenosine receptors, intentionally blinding the brain to its own severe exhaustion. The adenosine continues to build up in the background like heavy water pressing against a cracked dam. The organism pushes harder, completely unaware that it is operating on borrowed metabolic time. When the stimulant eventually metabolizes, the dam violently breaks. Accumulated exhaustion floods the cerebral cortex all at once, forcing a catastrophic autonomic crash. To prevent the organism from shutting down entirely, the adrenal glands panic, pumping out a massive secondary wave of adrenaline. This unbreakable cycle of artificial stimulation and profound crashing actively destroys the adrenal system and slowly suffocates the hippocampus. 4 silent diseases cause cellular death, multiplying the exact moment the human organism adopts a lifestyle devoid of true singular focus. The hyperactive brain refuses to focus on one thing because single tasking forces it to confront the massive neurochemical debt accumulated over years of neglect. Constant busyness becomes an anxiety escape protocol. The biological machine is terrified of stopping. The individual works out of a clinical inability to endure the agonizing withdrawal symptoms of a fried dopamine system. This permanent fight-or-flight state forces healthy brain cells into a zombie-like senescence. They release highly inflammatory cytokines, turning vibrant memory centers into inflamed, necrotic tissue. The Diderot effect of cognitive decay. This internal terror dictates all external behavior, and that frantic behavior destroys the absolute foundation of human intellect. This terrifying destruction is massively accelerated by a psychological phenomenon that locks the organism into an unbreakable downward spiral. It is the Diderot effect of cognitive decay. Just as buying one luxury item forces the purchase of another, one distracted behavior forcefully triggers a chain reaction of toxic, shallow habits. When highly valuable attention is hijacked by a single notification, the brain receives a microdose of cheap dopamine. This creates an immediate, agonizing craving for another hit. The organism abandons meaningful work and frantically seeks out another minor task. Checking an email inevitably leads to browsing a news feed, causing a complete collapse of sustained attention. The inability to maintain single-minded focus directly leads to massive consumption of more cheap dopamine. This further degrades the attention span, causes more internal stress, and ultimately requires even more distraction to numb the psychological pain. The organism becomes a permanent prisoner to the noise, systematically trained to reject deep thought. Every single time a memory is formed, it requires the physical strengthening of microscopic connections between neurons, a biological process known as long-term potentiation. This complex process demands immense amounts of metabolic energy in absolute uninterrupted time. When the brain is constantly yanked from one context to another, the strengthening process is brutally aborted. The memory is never solidified. Information simply washes over the brain and disappears into the void. The professional spends 10 exhausting hours processing data, yet retains absolutely nothing of long-term value. Endless busyness is an active execution of the biological machine. Rewiring the brain for deep memory retention. The ultimate biological leverage is not brute force effort or frantically juggling a dozen projects. The ultimate leverage is metabolic preservation and impenetrable focus. True systemic restoration of the memory centers occurs entirely in the dark, far away from the chaos of the modern schedule. Just as a bamboo plant spends 5 full years building a massive root system underground before violently shooting 20 meters into the sky, the central nervous system requires profound, zero-friction work to rebuild its capacity for elite memory retention. Completely halt the rapid mutation of glial cells and firmly reverse spreading neuroinflammation, the organism must manually trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. This cannot be achieved by passively watching a screen or switching to a less demanding task. True cognitive repair requires environments engineered for absolute zero distraction and the uncompromising absence of external dopamine triggers. Elite performers consistently treat their attention as their most sacred biological asset. They engineer daily routines to ruthlessly protect deep work windows with the exact same aggression used to protect financial capital. Ignoring trivial tasks is not laziness. It is the highly active regeneration of the hippocampus. It is the biological resetting of the dopamine baseline to restore intrinsic motivation and the deliberate chemical lengthening of memory pathways. Being constantly busy actively destroys the structural integrity of the brain. Mastering the rare art of uncompromising focus actively protects it. The choice between early cognitive decline and elite long-term mental dominance dictates the entire future of the human organism. True elite status is achieved by maximizing high-quality output per hour, not by maximizing tasks completed per day. Clinical optimization of the central nervous system allows for hyperdense periods of cognitive labor, followed instantly by deep, unapologetic recovery. The individual who masters this biological rhythm will always outlast and outthink the professional trapped in the chaotic cycle of endless busyness. Neural pathways are a sacred baseline that must be brutally protected from toxic hustle culture. The biological machine must be respected, or it will inevitably destroy itself.